All right, our final presentation this morning will be Ahmad Daniels, and I'm going to just read a little bit about him and then have him come up. Ahmad Daniels is a transformation facilitator and life coach with over 20 years experience in community outreach programs, diversity training, and African American history. He's the founder of Creative Interchange, an organization whose mission is to enhance personal and community social capital through change philosophies, personal empowerment, and self-actualization. He's also the founder of 2 Your Journey self-empowerment workshops at Create an Environment, where participants are encouraged and self-compelled to engage in heartfelt conversation that lead to more meaningful relationships. And he is also with Veterans for Peace. And Ahmad, if you want to come up and just tell us a little bit about yourself. Thank you.
Wow, this has been a fantastic morning. Hoorah indeed, hoorah indeed. I'm going to tell you a little more about Veterans for Peace a little later. But as many of you probably know, and perhaps you've even saw on television, Public Education did a wonderful documentary a week or so ago on the Great War, World War I. It was a 3 two-hour sessions that appeared on television. I recorded it and watched it last night. And what touched me a great deal about that war, it was the war to end all wars. It was the war when it first began. America was the 17th power in the world. But by the time it ended, America was a world power, numero uno. What stood out for me was the role of the African American during that time. Woodrow Wilson had the opportunity as president of these United States to begin to bring an end to segregation by allowing blacks to be in the White House and do some of the things, and I don't mean as domestics, but he elected not to. When things began to happen and blacks wanted to join, they were told they could not because there was a great fear among Southern whites that if you dare to put guns in the arms of black soldiers, they may not have to go all the way to Europe to find their enemy. So all those things began to happen, and it reminded me a great deal of my own journey. When I joined the Marine Corps in 1966, I joined at the tender age of 17. My parents had to sign me in. I had finished high school, and I wanted to be a Marine. Why a Marine? Well, I had a brother who was in from 1959 to 1963, and his journeys to Japan, to Cuba, were most exciting. And when I learned about, and having watched years and years of Audie Murphy and John Wayne, the indoctrination was pretty doggone thorough. And there's as you know, many of you who have been in Marines, there's that Marine Corps hymn. And I won't go over the first and second stanza, but I will repeat the third one because it's that drove home the point to me that there was no greater fighting force in the history of mankind than the Marine Corps. Here's health to you and to our Corps, which we are proud to serve. In many a time we fought for life and never lost our nerve. If the Army and the Navy ever looked on heaven's scene, they will find the streets are guarded by United States Marines. Now, I said that kind of arrogance, that God with his or her omnipotence, omniscience, all of that and he can't get it done, or she can't get it done, that they have to enlist the services of the Marines. I said, that's the way I want to go. So I joined. And I joined, and my score was high enough where I wouldn't have to become a grunt. I went through jet mechanic school in Millington, Tennessee, and I was undergoing training to become a jet mechanic. I did the math. I said, jet mechanics, when I get out, they make a heck of a lot of money. TWA was around at that time. Eastern Airlines was around at that time. And I don't think any of them dragged people off the plane if their seat became needed. But I'm getting off the subject only somewhat here. So when I joined, I loved the Corps. I loved America. And I always went to church every Sunday as a Christian on base. But there was this one Sunday that I realized a while back, because I went to Memphis a lot, And when I went to Memphis, that was the old Memphis. We're talking about 1967 now. The old Memphis, where the partying was great, and that was the place to be. And so I would go there. But one Sunday I said, I'm going to go to the church off the base. So I put on my uniform. And when I put on my uniform, you could have eaten off my shoes because that's how clean they were. You could have sliced your bread on the crease of my trousers because that's how sharp. I was immaculate, cleaner than the Board of Health. And when I walk into this church in my uniform, proud as I could be, the first thing I hear is, get your black ass out of here. I had never experienced Jim Crow before growing up in New York City. Dated white girls, had white guys on the track team, neighbors were white. All that was new to me. My parents, who were both from the South and who knew about those ways, protected us and shielded us every time we went south. We never went to a Jim Crow store, colored white. We always took our own food, picnic baskets, so we always stopped on the highway to eat. This is great, you know. I never understood it. But that experience caused me to walk out of that church. And I had an epiphany. I realized that there was something wrong if I could fight for this country. But I cannot pray with those whose skin tones were different than my own. So I went to the library, and that was new for me. Marine enlisted men do not go to the library. We go to topless bars. We have a pocket full of $1 bills for you-know-what. But something said to go to the library. And I went to the library and picked up 3 books. Crisis in Black and White by Charles E. Silverman, Who Speaks for the Negro by Robert Penn Warren, and Richard Wright's White Man Listen. And in these books were conversations and interviews with people whose names I knew nothing of. Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Floyd McKissick. The list went on and on and on. And I began to ask myself, what am I doing in this military? Because I had learned that black people had fought in every single war this country's ever had. We were the first to be ready to call to action, but we always came back hoping that we would now be recognized as full-class citizens, that we would no longer have to sit on the back of the bus, that there would no longer be redlining, that we will have shown through the sharing of our blood, sweat, and tears that we've earned our place in this country. We weren't asking for any handouts. We wanted a place in this country too. Well, I flunked out of aviation school. I became so disillusioned, I didn't care anymore. So now I am in Camp Pendleton. My MOS, which was 6311, the wing, was now 0311, the ones that carry the M14s through the jungles. Well, it's now the summer of 67, and I'm in the mountains with other Marines, black, white, smoking reefer and drinking Akadama plum wine, and having discussions about what was taking place in our cities. If any of you remember the summer of 67, there was a lot of urban unrest. There were tanks rolling down the streets of Newark and Detroit with 50 caliber machine guns mounted on the turret. And if any of you have been in the military, you know how lethal a 50 round could be in a tenement-like situation. When fired, it would easily pass through a wall, tear off someone's head, and continue until it's torn off someone's leg. And this is what they had going down the streets of the inner city in 1967 in Newark and Detroit and other cities also. So I began to ask the other Marines, why should we go to Vietnam and have to fight yellow people and then have to come back and fight white people, apparently? Now, I didn't know anything about in April 4th, 1967, that Dr. King had made a wonderful speech in opposition to the war in Vietnam. That never occurred to me. I didn't know anything about King. So when I started talking to the other Marines, we said, well, what can we do? I said, well, let's speak to the commanding general. He has 3 stars on his shoulder. I was a lowly E2, a PFC, and I didn't have the answers. I hadn't been to college yet at that point. So we said, well, let's go speak to him. Now, if any of you know anything about the chain of command, you do not go knock on the commanding general's door. You start with your first sergeant and then lieutenant, and you work your way up the ranks. So the next morning in formation, I said, First Sergeant, there are some of us here that would like to start the process of requesting mass to speak to the commanding general. And he said, who? And I did like that. And about 10 black Marines took a step forward. I have learned since then, if 10 black males aren't wearing basketball uniforms or football uniforms, they could be very frightening to those who are on the receiving end. So he said, if any of you go beyond me, I'll make sure you're all locked up for mutiny. So I said, well, they took a step back because they didn't know, they didn't have the consciousness, they didn't have the awareness. They didn't believe that going to jail would be better than going to Vietnam and killing women and children and everybody else that was there too. So I said, well, when the time comes, they'll give me my 5 years, because that's what I would have been facing, and I will be the recipient of a dishonorable discharge. Well, they didn't wait for that point to come. They called in the officers of naval intelligence, who began questioning these Marines. Did Daniels ever tell you not to get a haircut? Did he ever tell you to refuse an order? Did he? The day came when I thought I was going home on leave before coming back for staging. The military police came, handcuffed me and another black Marine named Harvey, and took us to the commanding general. And he read off a charge sheet saying, in essence, that we had violated a 1940 Smith Act, which made it a crime to counsel, urge, cause, and attempt to cause insubordination and refusal of duty. To the brig we went. So we're in jail for 4 months waiting for our trial to come about. And during that time, my father passed. Now, normally if a parent passes and the Red Cross approves it, they will escort you to the funeral. They did not do that. My brother, who was serving 40 years for having killed someone, and he was up at a place called Attica. I don't know if any of you know anything about New York, but that's the major prison where they had a major prison riot in '72, I believe it was. They brought him to the funeral, and they had handcuffs on him, of course, and they put a coat over it to hide that. So I could not even attend my father's funeral, and I hadn't been found guilty. Well, my trial finally came. I had this young captain who didn't know anything about the First Amendment. See, there's something about the military. They know how to handle murderers. They know how to handle rapists. They know how to handle thieves, but they don't know how to handle political prisoners and people who think for themselves. That was something they could not do. Court-martial gave me 10 years and a dishonorable discharge. So here I am. At that time, Marine, Navy, and Coast Guard went to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Army and Air Force went to Fort Leavenworth. So I'm in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, looking at 10 years and a dishonorable discharge. And guys are coming back from Vietnam for rape, murder, sticking bottles up women's vaginas, cutting off ears, doing the most sadistic things imaginable, and none of them had 10 years. I'm saying, how could you have done that to another human being and you get 2 years, 3 years? So I said, I don't want the military representing me on appeal, because in the military, there's a convening authority, then the Judge Advocate General, and then COMA, the Court of Military Appeals, which is one court below the Supreme Court. I started writing people. I wrote Ebony Magazine. They said they couldn't help. I wrote the NAACP. They couldn't help. I wrote the American Civil Liberties Union, and they began representing me. And after 2.5 years of incarceration, I finally got an honorable discharge and back pay. It was through the ACLU and their publicizing my case to the extent that they did. I have a scrap album about that thick now with Washington Post, New York Times, Playboy. Yes, Playboy does have serious articles. It's not just about pictures. They've interviewed some of the great minds of all time, but they covered my case. And I became a cause celeb. I went back to that church in Memphis years later, about 10, 20 years later. The church was no longer there, the base was closed. But I wanted to thank those people that were there, and they probably were not the same ones who kicked me out in '67. But I wanted to thank the pastor, because they did me a favor. Because had they not kicked me out of that church, I would have proudly and gladly gone to Vietnam. I would not have known anything about my history. I would not have known that I was contributing much of what has occurred in every war this country's ever had, where blacks have gone and fought and hoped to be treated with respect and then come back to find that was not the case. When I go to DC, and I go there periodically, I never fail to go to the Vietnam Memorial, because many of those to whom I spoke with, other black Marines, their names are on there. And I know quite well that had it not been for those at that church who told me to get my black derriere, they didn't speak French, to get my black derriere out of there, my name would have been engraved on that wall also. I respect those who gave their lives. And I respect the conscientious objectors who realized that this was not a war America should have been in. Dr. King was a pacifist, but Dr. King said had it been during World War II, he would have gladly suspended his pacifism because Hitler was such a tyrant. He was such an evil force to be reckoned with. But he saw the war in Vietnam as an evil, unjust, and futile war and encouraged people to take a CO, go to jail, do not participate in that war. I knew nothing about that at that time, but I do understand that. So when I got out, and years later, I joined Veterans for Peace, our chapter is called the Winter Soldier chapter of Veterans for Peace. Some of you may remember from history in your Government 101 or civics, Thomas Paine, who wrote this wonderful treatise called Common Sense that was used to educate people as to why they should break away from England. And what he said was, he said, summer soldiers and sunshine patriots will retreat in times of crisis, but it's the winter soldier, it is the winter soldier that will stay the course. So the Winter Soldier chapter of Veterans for Peace is something I'm proudly of, am playing a part of. Now, we're not pacifists in all of that. We do believe that war is, but we also know that nobody understands the harmful effects, the damages that can occur from war except for the veteran who had paid the price, who had seen it. We're so removed from it over here. We've been fortunate. We may have seen it on television during the Vietnam era, but there's nothing like that anymore that's being depicted on television. Many of us got bothered because of the gas incident that took place in Syria, but people had been dying for years. But the whole thing was, nobody wanted to see children whose heads were blown off. Nobody wanted to see men and women whose guts were spread all over the streets. So nobody showed that. They wouldn't send pictures of that back. But we were willing to take a look at bodies that were intact but had been killed by way of gas. It's our choice to remain aware of what's going on. We Americans, to whom much is given, much is required. And when I realized my children knew very little of my dealings, I decided to write a book. I brought extra copies for those who would like to buy it. I'm going to get a shameless plug in there. But it chronicles in more detail my journey through that. And there are plenty of Peace in Our Times, one of the papers that Veterans for Peace will put out. And what's on the cover, Veterans Stand with Standing Rock. Veterans know justice after having seen so many years of injustice. And it's a wonderful thing to every time I've seen what was happening at Standing Rock before they shut it down and finished building the oil pipeline. It was a shame that that happened, but that's something that we're doing. I love America, and I want to see America do to people what she says on paper. Freedom, justice, equality, and all those high-polluting words that the framers of the Constitution wrote about. But it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we make her do what she is supposed to be doing. It won't happen by being ignorant of the law. It won't happen by being apathetic of the law. It can only happen when we hold her to the standard by which we know this country can possibly do. And racism, white supremacy, fear of women, LGBT, all these other things is not what America is about. We must remain attentive, we must remain aware, and that's incumbent upon all of us, but particularly the veterans who know that shedding blood is easy if it's not your children, if it's not your husband, if it's not your daughter, if it's not your wife, that you sit back in a lofty office and just sign a paper and there troops go fighting. If you ever get a chance to see the Great War and that took place during World War I, you'll see a lot more of the atrocities and how great it was that America did participate. Because don't forget, isolationism was the theme. There were many women who went to jail protesting the fact that we should not be minding business in Europe. Let France, let England, let Germany, let Belgium, let them fight their own fight. That's not our fight. But after the sinking of the Lusitania, and after those German subs continued to blow up American ships, and they had good justice for doing that, because on those American ships were armaments meant for the Brits. It wasn't like these ships were just touring ships and people were just partying. No, they had armaments on that ship. That's why the Lusitania sank in only 16 minutes. That huge, size of 3 football fields went down in 16 minutes because all those explosions, all the armaments that were below the hull began to blow up at the same time. I want to thank you for the invitation. If there are any questions, I'd certainly like to entertain some of them. But I'm a proud vet. I'm a proud Marine, not because I killed people, but because my case is when anybody studies the First Amendment in military school, they're going to read Daniels versus the Marine Corps. That is my present. That's my legacy. That law students will have to learn that, yes, although we don the uniform of these United States, don't abridge the First Amendment freedom of speech. We are thinking people. We do have minds. And yes, we follow orders when they're good orders, and it's up to us to determine, I feel in my case, to determine what was good and what was not. And I was not one to run away. I wasn't going to Canada. I wasn't going to go to Europe. I was willing to go to jail for my beliefs. And just as you'll see if you watch that movie about World War I, what this country did to those conscientious objectors when they took them to Fort Leavenworth and took off their clothes and made them stand in 16-degree weather, and how they would keep them handcuffed 16, 17 hours a day with their feet barely touching the ground, because these were people that would not fight, who did not want to go, and who also paid the price. Freedom is not free. It never will be. It's up to us to keep this country the way it should be. It's up to us to make it what it can be, and I certainly thank you for your time.